This presentation draws on a paper I wrote 3 years ago, published in the book Lost Kingdom: Animal Loss in the Anthropocene. Given the limited time today, I'll only cover the core arguments, but if you're keen on reading my paper, I can gladly send it to you. I don't have a PowerPoint today, I'll just be following my notes. I will begin with an introduction to large-scale animal use and abuse, then I discuss why we should treat wildlife trade and industrial animal farming as a continuum between genocide and ecocide and not as legal and normal economies. The final part of my paper, which I'll have to skip, is a reflection on killing, complicity, and grief. Since this was for me just a thought experiment, some aspects might come across as unrealistic or a bit of a stretch, which they are. Also, parts of what I'll share will be basic to those of you with an advanced background in animal rights issues, but with this paper, I wish to raise awareness primarily among those not concerned with our crimes against animals, perhaps not vegan, and so on. I appreciate everyone's feedback since I'll probably get back to this paper to expand it at some point. So first, an introduction to large-scale animal use and abuse. Industrial animal farming and wildlife trade victimize trillions of animals every year. They are the main organized forms through which we confine, exploit, torture, and massacre non-human animals. I chose industrial animal farming and wildlife trade as illustrations for my discussion of the genocide-ecocide continuum because of their enormous scale, their normalized cruelty, and their harms on humans, non-humans, and nature overall. First, wildlife trade. It is a global phenomenon estimated annually at billions of dollars. It includes both legal and illegal forms, the latter often embedded in organized crime networks. Some of these are also involved in drug, arms, and human trafficking, also in illegal forms of logging, mining, and other environmental crimes. Though both plants and animals are treated, I will only discuss animals given my concern for the suffering of sentient beings. As documented by wildlife criminologists and by national and international agencies, billions of wild animals are yearly uprooted from the wild. They are or bred in captivity, confined in horrific conditions, tortured, and killed. The legal and illegal trade in wild animals is driven by our drive to consume, literally or figuratively, their bodies. Just a few examples of animals victimized by wildlife trade. Animals are confined and tortured in medical experiments: mice, rats, primates, zebrafish, and so on. They are killed for their meat, such as deer, boar, buffalo, monkeys, pangolins, rodents, birds, insects. Um, they are um, they are brutalized for their skin or fur, such as crocodiles, alligators, snakes, frogs, chinchillas, sables, minks, raccoons, and so on. Their body parts are used in so-called traditional alternative medicine. We've all heard of the use of pangolin scales. Shark fins are also used, tiger bones, bear bile, rhino horns, dried seahorses, and so on. Wild animals are also killed by hunters for their bodies to be turned into trophies or ornaments. Um, Other animals are specifically bred for being killed. For instance, the practice of canned hunting of lions in South Africa, and other animals are held captive for life in zoos, aquariums, circuses, or homes, especially felines, primates, birds, reptiles, and so on. So as we see, defining wildlife trade is not death because that's a naturally inevitable phenomenon, but it's often killing, whether that's deliberate or out of negligence or ignorance. To me, significant here is the misleading distinction between the legal and illegal wildlife trade, and that between exploitation and overexploitation. These concepts are key to the legal regime of wildlife trade, since national and international laws allow trade in some wild animals and prohibit or restrict trade in others. The distinction is often arbitrary, and obviously the legal status of the crime is irrelevant to its victims. Whether legal or illegal, wildlife trade still causes suffering for billions of sentient individuals. So when discussing wildlife trade as a form of both genocide and ecocide, I include animals victimized by both legal and illegal trade, and I treat most instances of legal trade in wild animals as criminal. Why? Because as I mentioned earlier, legal and illegal trade involves similar or identical suffering-inducing practices, and my focus is on the animal victims. For instance, crimes against countless individuals are permitted under the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora if their species is not endangered. The legal status of criminal sectors does not make the abuse more tolerable for non-human victims, and that's what I believe applies to both wildlife trade and to industrial animal farming. Besides causing suffering and illegal trade or extinction crisis and to ecosystem collapse. To contextualize the magnitude and cruelty of wildlife trade, I will share just one example. Pangolins are the world's most trafficked mammal. Over 1 million pangolins have been abducted from the wild. Over the past decade, about 20 tons of pangolin body parts are trafficked every year, mostly from Africa to China and Vietnam, which are the primary consumer markets, where pangolin meat is considered a delicacy and pangolin scales are used for their supposed healing properties. So pangolins are protected in most of their countries of origin and under international legislations under CITES. Pangolins continue to be trafficked, and out of 8 pangolin species, now 2 are listed as vulnerable, 3 as endangered, and 3 as critically endangered. So pangolin trafficking shows us that the reductionist anthropocentric way in which laws conceptualize non-human victims is out of touch with the scale, cruelty, and the ecological ramifications of current realities. Despite the legal protections pangolins supposedly enjoy, they are now threatened with extinction in the wild. It is for this reason that I believe concepts like genocide and ecocide more accurately reflect the realities of wildlife trade. Wildlife trade often involves massive massacring of individual animals, which should qualify as genocide, as well as broad environmental destruction, which could constitute ecocide. Let us now turn to industrial animal farming, which to me also embodies this intersection between genocide and ecocide. Industrial animal farming does not only cause suffering for billions of sentient beings, but also contributes to climate change. It pollutes the air, the land, and the water. It decimates wildlife, contributes to the extinction crisis. It exposes humans to foodborne pathogens, and because of its inefficiency and unsustainability, it contributes to global food injustice and food insecurity. The scale of this industry, the sophistication of technologies facilitating extraction and murder, and the intensity of animal suffering from confinement, torture, and killing are all unprecedented today. Globally, over 92 billion land animals and trillions of fish are killed for food yearly. The broken lives of sentient beings become mere statistics. The brutality of industrial animal farming is significantly synergistic with other industries dedicated to harm and killing. And here I would name the weapons industry in particular. Advanced technologies of violence allow the massive scale and efficiency of killing and distance physically and psychologically the killer from the killed. Farmed animals are massacred with firearms, with captive bolt pistols, electrical killing and stunning machines, carbon dioxide chambers, and so on. Without these, of course, immobilizing and murdering billions of animals would come with a hefty physical and moral burden for those in charge of killing. Death and killing are not limited to the billions of farmed animals, but their suffering also leads to other forms of suffering, killing, and death. Meat production and significantly meat consumption, since production rests on carnistic beliefs and lifestyles, contributes to the extinction crisis. While, as we saw earlier, the relation between wildlife trade and species extinction is direct, industrial animal farming indirectly impacts biodiversity loss because in many parts of the world, forests are wiped out to make room for meat, dairy, egg, and leather production. This includes livestock raising facilities and huge expanses of land dedicated to growing crops to feed the animals we raise to eat. An estimated 80% of deforestation globally is the result of agribusiness. So the impact of industrial animal farming is not limited to the suffering of billions of farmed animals, which again, in my opinion, could qualify as genocide if we stretch the concept, but it's also about the wide environmental externalities, which could, and in many cases do qualify as ecocide. However, all these externalities are not currently incorporated in the price of meat due to heavy subsidies in many countries, which keep meat artificially cheap, which of course keeps the demand and supply high. So when it comes to industrial animal farming and wildlife trade, we witness how the intersection of large-scale animal killing and environmental damage takes the form of this continuum between genocide and ecocide. Next, I will move to some broad reflections on this genocide-ecocide continuum. Why these two sectors should be treated as a continuum between genocide and ecocide and not as normal and legal economies. This approach, of course, contrasts their current legal status, which permits the majority of killing and ignores the externalities of the process, such as we saw earlier, the genocide of farmed animals, leading in some cases to genocide and ecocide when it comes to wild animals. So what is the status of animals? In all jurisdictions, they are property, which means they are objects, not subjects, though some countries have recognized animal sentience. Animals remain legally designated as property, and only exceptionally they have been granted some limited rights. Most countries have anti-cruelty laws, but these laws adopt a very narrow definition of cruelty. They are often not enforced, mostly cover companion animals, and we don't have an international convention on animal rights or welfare. In this context, I look at both industrial animal farming and wildlife trade as violating animal rights, not only the limited rights legally recognized by a few jurisdictions, but the expansive rights sentient animals should have. When we think of animals, it's very easy to notice that they have identities as distinct individuals. We know that no two animals are identical in their physical characteristics and personality, and they're also distinct as species. Their rights should be predicated on an awareness of these identities, of their needs, abilities, and contributions. And from this flows the argument that the massive killing of farmed and wild animals manifests as genocide. So, what's the legal status of genocide? The 1948 UN Convention on Genocide defines genocide as, quote, acts committed with intent to destroy in whole or in part the national, ethnic, racial, or religious group. We notice here the focus is on identity. Individuals are not randomly targeted, but victimized because of their membership to a specific group. I believe this applies also to our treatment of animals in the context of industrial animal farming and wildlife trade. Why? Because certain animals are confined, tortured, and killed because of how their characteristics and thus identity serves us. We don't farm all or any animals. We predominantly farm a few species like chicken, turkeys, pigs, cattle, sheep, goats, and so on, considered fit for consumption. Similarly, we don't abduct and exploit any wild animals, but a select few whose bodily characteristics fit our consumer needs. Whether it's carnism pushing us to consume their bodies, or it's voyeurism and exoticism driving our needs to watch or own unusually looking rare animals, living or dead. Returning to the Genocide Convention, acts included under genocide are killing members of the group, causing them serious bodily or mental harm, imposing on them living conditions calculated to physically destroy the group in whole or in part, preventing births, forcibly transferring children out of the group. Again, just like with the identity criterion earlier discussed, I believe these genocide criteria also apply to different segments of industrial animal farming and wildlife trade, because in different forms, all these acts are routinely inflicted on domestic and wild animals. They are killed, they are physically and psychologically harmed, the births are either forced or prevented, and millions of babies are separated from their mothers. The legal regime on genocide has been critiqued as being too narrow and exclusionary. However, these critiques only discuss the human victims left outside the legal conceptualization of genocide. Less attention has been devoted to how our beliefs, institutions, industries, laws, and so on are dedicated to the systematic annihilation of non-humans, and how the tragedy endured by trillions of sentient beings could itself be a form of genocide. Since genocide designates annihilation driven by identitarian considerations, I believe a significant omission here is that belonging to a species is also a form of identity, and perhaps is more fundamental than other identity markers such as ethnicity, nationality, religion, race, which are now considered under the legal definition of genocide. Species-driven annihilation faced by non-humans is more widespread and severe than any atrocities now faced by humans because of their various identities. The unprecedented scale of violence we inflict on animals turns them into the primary victims of contemporary forms of annihilation, and here genocide and ecocide become a continuum. However, the anthropocentric nature of the Genocide Convention is unsurprising, since law and politics generally are driven by human-centric considerations. And most legal systems treat the differences between species as a necessary hierarchy, just as in the past and sometimes still now, ethnic, religious, gender, or class differences were turned into hierarchies, normalizing the use and abuse of so-called inferior others. Another reason why for the omission of species in the legal discourse on annihilation is that the scale, intensity, and brutality of our exploitation of other species, as well as the global species extinction crisis, are both new phenomena unforeseen when the Genocide Convention was introduced. Since changing laws is complicated and slow due to political, economic, social, and cultural factors which skew our notion of morality and legality, just as we've seen with other grave forms of wrongdoing, crime can continue unabated for centuries or millennia before criminal law catches up. While genocide is still considered the crime of all crimes, yet resting on a narrow conceptualization of annihilation, which excludes many humans and all non-humans, ongoing ecocides remain non-criminalized, though far more widespread, more frequent, and more severe than any recognized human genocide. Efforts to criminalize the ecocide have been ongoing since the early 70s, yet have remained unsuccessful due to state and corporate interests to continue reaping profit of environmental extraction and destruction. These crimes are seldom individual and isolated acts of negligence or malfeasance. More commonly, they can be classified as state crimes, corporate crimes, or state corporate crimes. Though many countries have limited criminal laws against environmental harm, ecocide is not criminalized, not under the ICC mandate. So we have no international laws recognizing and punishing extensive environmental destruction. Proposals for the legal recognition of ecocide go back 5 decades ago and are tied to the history of chemical warfare, the Vietnam War in particular. And in my paper, I reviewed the history of legal and civic proposals to criminalize ecocide. Because of the limited time now, I'll have to skip that. Since ecocide is not criminalized, significantly environmental destruction, of course, can continue unabated. Civil litigation, the routes through which states and companies are typically held accountable for environmental harms, typically leaves corporations only paying limited fines or compensations, and that allows them to continue profit from environmental destruction. Another significant point here is that ecocide is not just important for non-humans in nature, but also for humans because ecocides are entwined with and often precursors of conflicts over natural resources, poverty, food insecurity, disease, displacement, corruption, authoritarianism, all of these adversely impacting peace and security. So concerns around ecocide are not limited to the degradation and eventual extinction of flora, fauna, and microorganisms, but extends to varied forms of harm against humans. And this drives the global movement advocating for the criminalization of ecocide, often described as the missing fifth crime against peace. With us notice that both genocide and ecocide as legal categories come with multiple obstacles for crime prevention, accountability, and repair. Genocide only criminalizes a very narrow portion of harms perpetrated against human beings, while ecocide is not criminalized. So talking about ecocide remains perhaps meaningful ethically, but void of any legal implications. I believe states should have ample positive and negative obligations towards all sentient beings under their jurisdiction. And from this perspective, our current harms against non-humans should not only be treated as crimes perpetrated by individuals, but also indirectly by states, because not criminalizing a grave harm is itself a form of criminality. So states are responsible for that. Discussed so far were just a few reasons why industrial animal farming and wildlife trade, the main forms through which we abuse animals today, should be treated as a continuum between genocide and ecocide, not as normal, necessary, and legal economies. This genocide-ecocide continuum, when it comes to industrial animal farming and wildlife trade, is significant because it shows us how animal rights law and activism can and should draw on established crimes in international criminal law, such as genocide, and on emergent crimes like ecocide at the intersection of environmental law and criminal law. The anthropocentric and commercial nature of the law, however, renders these barbaric practices so normal that they become invisible as long as they serve human needs and wants and they serve corporate profit. I believe that the horrific crimes of industrial animal farming and wildlife trade are a reminder that we need to reconsider humanity, inhumanity, and animality, and accordingly elevate law and everyday ethics. And I think I'm done because we're close to the half hour limit. Thank you for joining me today.